Hello everybody, welcome to this webinar. We will just give everyone a minute or so to arrive. Thanks all for being here, and then we'll kick things off just as soon as people have all been able to get in the door. Okay, well, let's get started. Hello everybody, thanks very much for joining us for this webinar. My name's Ben Wheeler, and I'm just here to introduce and chair this session really. The webinar's in association with our project, which is a part of the SWEEP programme, which is a collaboration between the University of Exeter and Plymouth Marine Lab and Plymouth University, funded by NERC. And it's all about developing societal benefit from environmental science research, particularly targeted here in the southwest of England, but obviously with a wider remit than that. We're interested in how this kind of stuff works across the UK and internationally. As it says here, the webinar is going to be recorded and it will make it available on our hub afterwards. You can find out more and sign up for our hub in association with this project, which is called Investing in Nature for Health, at the website there, or you can just Google for sweep.ac.uk and you'll find us. So I'm really delighted today to be introducing a really fascinating panel discussion, hopefully, on alternative funding mechanisms for green space. A really important kind of issue, obviously, and we've been developing a piece of work in association with our SWEEP project to produce a report and hopefully a useful information resource around all the different ways in which alternative funding mechanisms can be used for green space. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Sian de Bell, who's led on producing that piece of work, and Sian will introduce that briefly. We'll then hand over to our four kind of expert guests, each to give their reflections on perceptions and experience of working on this kind of issue. And then we'll open things up for a panel discussion. So please, as we go through the talks and presentations, feel free to stick any questions you have into the Q&A box. We'll be picking those up and we'll address all the questions that we can in the time that we've got available after everybody's had their chance to give their brief kind of presentations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sian and ask you to introduce the report, please.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I want to introduce the reason that we decided to organise this webinar to launch our report on alternative funding mechanisms for green space. So this report really came out of something I think a lot of projects faced at the start of the pandemic, when we were changing our activities and speaking to our partners about what their concerns were and what the challenges might be for green space going forward. And whilst there were concerns about the short term, about things like managing green space with social distancing, it was really the long term that people saw challenges with kind of impact of the pandemic, potentially conflict or adding to things that green spaces were already facing around funding. Next slide, please, Ben. So green spaces need funding both for development and management and maintenance, but also to support activities and interventions within them. And that's really important in terms of supporting our health and well-being, which is something that the pandemic and the lockdowns have really highlighted. So there's some research coming out at the moment which has looked at how people use green space in lockdown, showing that whilst people might have used it less due to restrictions on how long or how many times you could leave home, that green space was still really important in supporting mental health and wellbeing, particularly those local green spaces close to home. But funding for green space has been really reduced over the last, particularly over the last decade, since austerity measures were brought in. And with the majority of funding coming from local authorities and from the third sector and organisations, with green space being a non-statutory requirement, it's somewhere where budget cuts can be made. And going forward with the recession that we're entering, with potential economic impacts from lockdown support, it's likely that budgets are only going to reduce for green spaces in the future. So that's the reason that we put this report together. Next slide. So the report is a summary of the breadth of funding mechanisms out there, and we summarised traditional and alternative funding mechanisms with a focus on those alternative funding mechanisms, but we wanted to include the traditional ones to kind of so you can see how they might complement each other or work in combination. And in the report, we've looked at the academic literature and grey literature, so things like evaluations and reports on successful uses of different kinds of funding, and also been directed by partners and stakeholders in the project and what would be most useful to know more about. And we've included mechanisms which could be used for the maintenance and management of green space and activities within them. So the report has definitions of different funding mechanisms, which we've categorised into 7 broad categories. And these kind of look at some of the opportunities and issues with these different funding sources. We've also drawn out some case studies which focus on mechanisms which have been applied successfully in different examples, but have the potential to be used much more widely. And we've also listed some key resources for specific mechanisms and also for kind of this topic area generally. Next slide, please. So just to run through briefly the kind of 7 broad categories and provide some examples of what might be included in each one. So the first one is taxation, so things like location-specific taxes and the use of business improvement districts and how they could be used to fund green infrastructure. There are income generation opportunities, so things like rental charges, but also loans, green bonds, sort of thing. Alternative management structures, so moving to being a charitable trust for managing green space, for example, and I think our panel will probably talk more about that. Planning and development opportunities, so this might be things like community infrastructure levy or involvement of the private sector through corporate social responsibility. Ecosystem development, so there's been some projects doing things like installing renewable energy sources in parks or using payments for ecosystem service schemes, and we've highlighted a cultural payment for ecosystem service scheme looking at recreational services. Charitable sector and voluntary sector funding, so looking for donations for from individuals or organisations, for example. And then multi-agency opportunities, so thinking about grant funding or accessing alternative public sector budgets. Next slide. So just to kind of finish off that quick run through, I think through looking at the literature, it's evident there isn't one approach that's going to be able to fund green spaces in the future. And in order to ensure that funding models are sustainable going forward, and looking at kind of examples where people have been successful in funding different types of green space, there's a need to look at different spatial scales to consider the different stakeholders involved and whether there's already a diversity of stakeholders involved in this area, but whether different organisations could be brought in. But most of all, to use as many different types of funding mechanisms and as many kind of complementary types as possible. So the report will be circulated after the webinar and also up on our Investing in Nature for Health Hub, and I'll pass back over to Ben and the panel to hear more about their experiences and thoughts on this.
That's great, thanks very much, John. As you say, we'll be circulating the report and making that available soon after the webinar this afternoon. So I'm really happy to be able to introduce 4 great panelists this afternoon, each of whom is going to give their kind of perspective and their experience. And then, like I say, we'll open up for Q&A. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Cathy Farah, who's the Foundation Manager from Bournemouth Parks Foundation. So over to you, Cathy. Thanks very much for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Ben said, I'm the manager of Bournemouth Parks Foundation, and we're a charity that was an independent charity established about just over 6 years ago now, through what was Nesta and National Lottery Heritage Fund's Rethinking Parks programme. In terms of why our Parks Foundation was created, or why other local authorities might be thinking about potentially having this charitable trust model, obviously austerity, as Shah mentioned already, and something that you'll all be aware of as well, has significantly impacted what local authorities' parks budgets are. And this Parks Foundation model is really prevalent in America, where their municipal government will run all of the maintenance of their parks, but they have a Parks Foundation which really concentrates on community involvement and then generating income through philanthropy. We also think that our Parks Foundation will engage with communities in different ways to perhaps how other local authorities would. And also we know that charities can access funds in different ways as well. So trying to generate more income for parks, whether or not that's through gift aid or through grants or legacies and donations that perhaps a local authority might not be able to access. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we do down here in Bournemouth, we deliver lots of different community projects and then fundraise for things in our green spaces. And all of our projects are all around improving people's health and well-being, trying to reconnect people with nature, and then really trying to bring all of the diverse communities that we have down here together into our open spaces. So whether or not that's running a social prescribing program that we do called Parks in Mind, delivering free park yoga. So we have up to sort of 250 people doing park yoga every Sunday, fingers crossed this summer, or running a community cafe in a park that perhaps a commercial organisation wouldn't be running that cafe in that park because of the slightly limited commercial and financial return. But actually we know that if we can get more people in our parks for longer, the health and well-being benefits are really significant there. So next slide, please. In terms of the fundraising that we've been doing as a charity, all of the projects that we fundraise for might be of interest to different residents, and that's what we know, that there's so many different sorts of park users, and we really want to add value to those parks and go above and beyond what the local authority are doing. So BCP Council delivers all of the maintenance and the parks development programme, and we're really here for enhancements and additionality. And a lot of the fundraising income that we actually generate will either be through grants from trusts and foundations, through working with philanthropists, and then running campaigns for local residents who might be willing to donate to some of our projects as well. Next slide, please. I just wanted to share one of the other specific projects that we've been working on, which was around creating a contactless donation solution for an outdoor environment. So we got a grant from Nesta's Rethinking Parks 2 programme, funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Community Fund. And we worked with an existing contactless provider called Goodbox to develop these units in an outdoor environment. So contactless donations were quite common within museums and churches and those sorts of things, but there wasn't a solution for actually for this sort of technology to be used in an outdoor environment. So we've prototyped over the last couple of years, and you can see the images of some different units that we've actually got in our open spaces down here in Bournemouth now. To the point where these units will actually start to be sold by Good Box now. So some went into Royal Parks in London just yesterday, actually, which was super excited to see the rollout start to happen here. But what we were really focusing on was trying to provide a solution that would be weatherproof, vandal proof, and we would know that that technology could work in an outdoor environment that wasn't manned, because obviously in an indoor environment those units would be checked regularly, and also providing a solar power solution for these as well. The probably most effective one that we've done to date was the polar bear one that you can see there, which was part of a Christmas tree wonderland event that the local authority puts on in Bournemouth Gardens. And when somebody was donating there, the polar bear's heart would illuminate, that you can see on the screen there, and you got this some audio of the polar bear's heart going ding 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 ding, and it was a really emotive message, and you can see how that really resonated with those people that were donating, that they actually knew that, you know, they were making a difference. You know, we have lots of messaging around the climate change and acting locally to make an impact globally, and you could see how that resonated with those people that were donating there. So yeah, really excited to be launching that more nationally now as well, and that's through Good Box, who are going to be selling those units for us. Next slide, please. Just wanted to share here what the fundraising journey's been for our charity as well. And apologies because the lines on this chart haven't quite come out properly when in these presentation slides, but the top line that you can see there is really how our income's grown over the past 5 years. As you'd expect, we started off very small with one member of staff with our charity, and then over the past 5 years we've generated more income. So this year we're forecasting our income will be just under £900,000, with all of that money being guaranteed to go back into our parks and open spaces as well. And I think, as I mentioned, the majority of that will be through trusts and grants. So probably about 70% of our income comes through that, and then about 17% through trading, and then through working with major donors, and then probably about 5 to 7% of our income comes from what we could describe as cash donations. So whether or not that is somebody actually donating through text, through our online, through our website, or through contactless donations. Next slide, please. So just finally, I wanted to share one of the projects that we've been working on more recently, which is our Future Parks project, which is funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund, National Trust, and MHCLG. And that's really a pioneering program, which is around finding new ways for local authorities to manage their whole green space estate. So rather than perhaps thinking about one green space, which traditionally you might have got a sort of a heritage fund bid for, it's really thinking a lot more strategically about parks and open spaces are managed. And we're one of 8 cities across the UK as part of that programme. I know you'll be hearing from one of our colleagues in Birmingham shortly as well. We've split our project down into 6 work streams, and sort of whether or not that's creating a new green infrastructure strategy, creating a new volunteering model that we'll be launching very soon, but then thinking more about the income generation elements of our project. We've really looked at what the commercial potential of our open spaces are, whether or not that's thinking about a new operating model for our trading activities. So just been working with a consultant to really look at the detail about what that operating model might look like, with one of the primary objectives really being ensuring that any income that is generated in parks actually stays within parks as well. And then the other work stream there is really around ensuring the financial sustainability of the Parks Foundation and making sure we're a really robust charity that going forward, when we're proposing new operating models, that we're in a great place to be delivering those as well. Next slide, please. And I'll just finish off with presenting some figures that have come out of a report from Vivid Economics, who are one of the partners in the Future Parks programme, which is really demonstrating what the social value of our open spaces are. So across Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, we have about 450 parks and open spaces, and a very conservative estimate of our actual visitors, it would be about 10 million people visiting those parks every year. Vivid Economics have estimated that there's about £231 million of calculable benefits to individuals and the climate when people are visiting those spaces. So, and the large majority of that are in health benefits that are delivered, with significant amount of that actually being a mental health benefit when people visit those parks and open spaces. So it equates to about £20 of health and wellbeing benefits when somebody actually visits a park. We've calculated that it costs the local authority about 55 pence per visit, and these are very sort of conservative estimates at the moment. So actually for 55 pence a visit, we're actually seeing that there's a return of £20 for that individual. So we know that actually if we can either increase the frequency or the duration of those visits, obviously being aware of the environmental impacts that might happen as a result, but we know that if we can increase the amount of people visiting our parks and open spaces, we're aiming to actually relieve the pressures on our health and social care services and actually just unlock even further the potential within our parks as well. I think that's all my slides, but I'm happy to take questions when we go over to the panel.
Thanks very much indeed, Cathy. That's great, fascinating introduction to what's been going on in Bournemouth. Really interesting stuff. So I'm going to hand over now to Nick Grayson, who's Green City Manager for Birmingham City Council. Over to you, Nick.
Hello, thanks. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from Cathy. I think it's fantastic the work they're doing there. But the way we've responded to the Future Parks Challenge is to look at things on a much longer term and much wider basis. Birmingham is also a member of the Biophilic Cities Network around the world, cities that want to put nature at the center of their decision making. And we've just set up a funding working group. And we were discussing yesterday that there are 3 categories of work that we're looking at. One is microfinance, looking at very small operations. One is macrofinance, how do you link it to the future green infrastructure levies and things. And the third one, which I'm going to focus on now, is, I think, being missed by the sector and nationally by the government, which is about capacity building and governance. And I think the reason we're in the position we are is due to governance and capacity building. And that's why I like this quote from Alberto Villoldo about needing a new map. And I think we really do. So next slide, please. If you look at the scale of the challenge that we've got in front of us, this is a graph taken from the government report for the Natural Capital Committee, which prompted the 25-year environment plan from government as being their response to this very graph. It's the scale of the challenge that worries me. The red line is the decline that we've all seen. And it's why have we seen that decline? And of course, the dotted red line is if we don't do anything, it's only going to get worse. But why? Can we really understand why that failure has happened? And to me, it's a lot to do with a systems failure. And therefore, in order to make a recovery on the green line, we need to restore or create a new system. We cannot just bolt things on to the existing system and hope that it's going to fix what's wrong, because I fundamentally believe it won't move quickly enough in order to meet the challenge that we've got. And certainly in a city like Birmingham, the challenges are huge. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing is a new governance model for the city and putting natural environment at the centre of decision-making. We're working with all 4 major components of the council: our employment, jobs and skills, economic department, our health and wellbeing services, which includes adult and social care, our children's services, which includes education, and our housing, planning and development services. And we're bringing the values and the benefits of green space and natural environment to those parts of the council and completely getting them to embed those benefits in their work so that they then build on this organizational capacity that actually they see those invisible benefits as being something of real visible help to them to deliver their strategic outcomes. So it's about growing that organizational capacity, and we're also extending that to all their partners, because all local authorities these days deliver everything in partnerships. Next slide, please. And why are we able to do this? It's partly because there's been this huge shift in global finance in terms of understanding the scale and the need to operate at scale and quickly and do things in a new way. The cause of the austerity was the very banking movement, but here you've got Mark Carney, who's now created the reporting procedures for all financial institutions around the world, and they are now compulsory in terms of looking for any, the ratings on their investment schemes have to meet that climate challenge, and they also have to meet the environment, social and governance challenge that's also a component of that, which means not doing to communities, but doing with, building from the base so that you move to a position of a just transition. This is a humongous scale shift that is happening, and we must all be very alert to it in terms of this is going to drive government policy, and the green sector and everything that is green is going to become a major, major priority, whether governments like it or not. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do as part of our program is identify how the green space, this FPA fractal is the Future Parks Accelerator. And the idea of a fractal in nature is that you get these repeated patterns. So they happen again and again and again at all scales. And what we're taking to the departments is the Sustainable Development Goals, which is how those international finance bodies are measuring their impact, affect and are part of the delivery mechanism for every part of the council. And each one of those ties back to the benefits that natural environment can bring. So we're putting this all under a banner of the City of Nature, and we're primarily addressing environmental justice and calculating that across the 5 capitals, not just natural capital, but how social capital, human capital, manufactured and financial capital all work across the city, connected to the SDGs throughout all operations. And you suddenly realize that they're all interdependent on the natural environment. This sets up a whole different understanding and potential for growing that capacity of who's involved, what the future resource is, and why everybody should be part of the solution, rather than just saying, come on, Parks Department, you could do better. So it's a holistic shift. I wish we had more time, but that just gives you a taste of what we're planning to do, which is a substantial change from the idea of a service overhaul. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Nick. Really fascinating stuff going on there, and yeah, really interesting ideas for us to discuss when we get to the Q&A section. So I'm going to hand over now to Dan Hurd, who's joining us, and Dan is Head of Corporate Finance at Triodos Bank. So over to you, Dan. I think you're still muted.
Classic, yeah.
Got you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Very nice to be here to talk to you today. I'm coming from a different place to Cathy and Nick, in that I work for Triodos Bank. We're a European ethical bank. We have a mission, which is to tackle climate change and social inequality. So everything we do, all our lending, all our investment, all our advisory work is focused on those two areas. I'm very interested in this whole idea of alternative financing for green space. It's sort of consistent with work we're doing in the nature-based or natural capital investment sector. We're currently working on 4 pilot projects around the country, trying to find out if it is possible to bring private investment in to fund nature and the restoration of the environment. It's an interesting area because I think we all accept that restoration of the environment is good for all of us, in that it potentially tackles climate change, it can stop flooding, it can restore biodiversity. Access to green space is good for our mental health, so it's good for all of us individually and communities. So there's a bit of a question about, it's on paper, the return on investment of investing in the environment or in green space, as Cathy identified a bit earlier, is a huge and very, very fast return on investment. So you might sort of say, well, why doesn't the government therefore just tax us all a little bit more and make that investment into our natural environment? Good question. Second alternative, it's such a fantastic return on investment that why don't we just borrow in the markets like we are for COVID at unbelievably low rates as a country and invest that fairly limited amount into restoring the environment like we're restoring and retaining the economy through COVID? Probably another good question. For whatever reason, those two alternatives are not really the way forward. We can't afford it. And instead, what the government is looking for is more innovative means of funding environmental restoration, protection of our green space, etc. And that really means levering in private investment, as Nick was just talking about. So I work for a bank and we do a lot of work around raising investment. This is right in our sort of sweet spot. And some of these projects we're working on, you know, I've got on the little map here, is about restoring peat in the Peak District, tackling flood management in the Forest of Bowland, creating salt marsh and ecotourism facilities in Devon, and cleaning up Poole Harbour through nutrient reduction schemes. And this is all about trying to create business models out of environmental restoration. So I think I can sort of stretch across to looking at, you know, preserving, maintaining green space for communities. Is there a way we can create an investable model around that? And I thought the report that Sian mentioned at the start was fascinating. I had to read through before this webinar, and found myself just looking at it going, wow, what a lot of brilliant ideas there are in here on paper. And the real challenge, I suppose, is to converting these great ideas on paper and these great returns on investment, which are theoretical really, into hard pounds so things can actually be delivered. Because when you look at a local authority, the cost of maintaining green space is a real figure because it comes out of their budget. The benefits to communities and the return on investment is a theoretical figure, unless we can somehow find a way to monetize it. So that's the challenge. We do a lot of work trying to support innovative new deals and transactions. We operate an investment crowdfunding platform, so we quite used to seeing communities come together and raising money to develop renewable energy projects or buy the local pub or develop a chain of retail outlets. And I think, you know, community investment crowdfunding, even community donation-based crowdfunding, is actually quite a powerful tool when we're talking about preservation of green space. We're not advising Bristol City Council, but they're obviously one of the 8 cities benefiting from the Future Parks programme that Cathy was just talking about. And they're looking at all the parks obviously in Bristol and inviting offers from prospective bidders, and that might well involve communities within Bristol, to come up with plans as to what they might be able to do with those parks, maybe on some sort of long-term lease or license basis. Now, it could be that all the funding for this does need to come through grants and philanthropy, but I wonder in the middle of that, is there actually you know, a business model that communities could start to create and share with each other as to how you do preserve this green space. And maybe if communities come together to actually fund the investment in parks and the maintenance of parks through a combination of literally pounds and volunteering time, you know, it's probably something we'll discuss in the panel. But I think this is quite an interesting area. So there is a role for sort of private sector investment, and maybe combined with philanthropy, combined with probably a lot of volunteering. I'd be interested to see how the panel responds to some of these questions. That's it for me. Thank you, Ben.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Dan. That's really fascinating perspective. And last but not least, I'm delighted to turn the mic over to Ian Mell, who is Senior Lecturer in Environmental and Landscape Planning at the University of Manchester. And I'll stop sharing my screen now because Ian is just going to talk to us. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Sean, for the invitation. I'd like to thank Cathy, Nick and Dan for stealing all the really good ideas and showing just what we can do. Unlike those three, I don't actually work in practice. I'm an academic, so I get to sit in my office and think about these things. But I think one thing that has been prominent in my own work about the last 7 or 8 years is this notion that we do need to look at these transitions for moving away from local authority funding, moving away from that reliance on central government for where the money is going to come from for parks, for environmental management, or for enhancement work. And I think the others have all touched on issues of variation in the amount of options that we have open to us. Do we move away from public to more private or more community-based investment? What kind of scale are we looking at? Are we looking at very small or larger scale investments? And how do you develop that portfolio of options to work from? And I suppose one good thing that has come out of austerity, if it is in fact a good thing, is potentially that it's forced everybody to think more innovatively about how they actually think about the environment and how they actually fund it. And I think just from my own experience of working in local authority, working in the environment sector, it was always that buffet really of options which we worked from. So in local authority, there were core grants. There was also things from Housing Growth Fund when we had those. We're looking at Section 106 and SIL, as Sean mentioned. And we were always looking for new alternatives, new partnerships, in much the same way that Nick has so eloquently talked about how Birmingham is pushing the envelope quite a lot. I think there's lots of options there which are very much close to being possible, but there's maybe a reluctance in local government to do them because of the shift in responsibilities or authority and a lack of internal knowledge about how these new ideas work. So these new forms of funding via ethical banking might be one way of doing this, as Dan just mentioned. And I think that organisational capacity and organisational understanding are key things that we constantly need to reconsider. If you look at companies and groups like Groundwork, they do amazing work, but their capacity has been sort of lessened due to austerity measures. The same with Natural England, the same with many different environmental organisations. But within these organisations, we still see a lot of knowledge which can be shared and moved around. And so people like Nick have been doing this for many years, and I think he's influenced a lot of very strategic thinking around local government, but also the partnerships that we might bring forward. And another example of where some of this has happened is in Liverpool, which has been in the news today for its new partnership with Fields in Trust, talking about the deeds of dedication. And I think one thing that Liverpool has pushed forward is this need to not rely upon the old-fashioned, the traditional ways of trying to fund things, and to move forward to look at who are the alternative funders from the private sector, for example, or who are the new funders, the contemporaries. Could it be civic institutions, so universities, for example, or football clubs? And I think what's really happened in the last 5 years is that people have started to realise that they do have to talk to other people. They do have to look to developers, look to communities, look to new banking systems. And I think the report that Sean and Ben have put together is really interesting in terms of showing the variation that we can draw from. But one additional thing I think that's really important is the need to have champions within local government, within the private sector, and within the environment sector. People who are going to push these boundaries, people who are going to look at how to develop these new relationships, and people who might be talking about taking a risk. And I think that's one thing that local authorities are incredibly averse to doing. They don't want to deem to be wasting public money. but moving for new ideas or new forms of funding, be it through corporate social responsibility, be it through new grants, or even formally EU grants or sponsorship deals, or even working with business improvement districts to try and look at how we can manage the local, then scale it up to a wider area, I think are things that we can all consider to be viable options. And so I think over the last 10 years, we've seen innovation, we've seen a variety of people come forward to take charge of some of these conversations. And I think that's been really informative in terms of taking the responsibility away from a single organisation or a single unit of government and trying to open it up to communities to take a leading role, because in many cases, they're the people who are really going to benefit, as well as looking to the private sector and the banking sector. And I think there's finally these notions of returns on investment, and the fact that investment in green infrastructure or biophilic cities will have a substantial benefit and return on investment for cities. And I think vivid economics work has been very influential in trying to sway some of the decision makers to think more carefully about investment in the landscape. So whilst I think we've got a long way to go in terms of how we fund and how we might use the report that Sian and Ben have put together to actually facilitate some of these changes, I think the conversations are going on, and I think the conversations and the details from Cathy and Dan and Nick have been really, really exciting in terms of what we might be doing in the future, and we should be looking to these things to sort of lead the way, really. So I'll stop there. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Really, really interesting perspectives. Okay, so thanks to all of our panelists for really interesting, useful kind of presentations, a lot of different ideas, some very specific, clearly some very immediate things that might be going on, but also sort of real vision for the future as well, and where we might be going in future decades. So I'm going to invite all the panel to switch your cameras back on, if that's all right. And we'll open things up for Q&A. And so we've already got a few questions coming through the Q&A box. Please feel free, anybody out there, to add questions if you've got them for the whole panel or for specific panelists. I'm going to kick off here first with a question that came in specifically for Cathy from Nicola. And the question is, if the foundation raises money for things that need extra maintenance and skills, so new planting trees and so on, does the council automatically support the maintenance within their own budgets, or does the foundation help cover some of those extra costs?
So any project we would deliver would have approval from the landowner. So predominantly we work with the council, we do work with other landowners as well. So we'd have prior approval from the landowner before we start the project. And depending on what that might be, that might dictate whether or not our foundation would pay for any of those project delivery costs. If it's part of what the local authority might be doing anyway, then it might be that they'd be able to pick up some of those costs, or alternatively we would pay for project management if we didn't have the skills in-house to deliver ourselves.
That's great, thank you. And I don't know if anybody's got other perspectives on that. I know that this is kind of significant issues. We've been doing some work on street trees recently, and it's really clear that there's a lot of good political kind of will towards tree planting programs, but not necessarily long-term tree maintenance programs, which are really needed to make them work. I don't know if other panelists have got views on that kind of long-term investment.
Well, certainly in Birmingham, I would say that progress has been totally stymied in the last 10 years, entirely due to maintenance budgets. So the potential for new green spaces or the potential for enhancements has been positively rejected. And in fact, it's really interrupted the relationship with the citizens, because to a large degree, the services felt compelled to actually push them away rather than draw them in, because you can't meet their demands or their expectations. So that might be an extreme case, but I think that's just an indication of how big the gulf is between where we need to be and where we actually are.
Yeah, Ian.
I think in addition to pick up on a point that Dan made as well, is really important here, that the costs are real things that the accountants in local authorities go, that is a number and it's a line, but benefits are always hypothetical. And as much as we all can say it's worth £91 billion for GI in London. It doesn't mean anything when it comes to that balance sheet. So we almost need some tangibles on the balance sheet to go, this is where the costs are being made. And that might be involved working with the CCGs and the NHS more to actually look at the reductions in the amount of money being spent on primary healthcare. It's very difficult data to sort of disaggregate, but I think with those real numbers on a sheet, people start to go, oh, okay, it's not just make-believe numbers that you've come up with on your lunch break, but it becomes a little bit more real for people to say, we can back this because we know the reductions are coming through.
Great, thanks, Ian. Dan.
Just to add to what Ian said, I think that's right. Actually, turning theoretical revenue streams into real money revenue streams is the big challenge of our age around restoring the environment and protecting green space, I think. And it's not easy, is it? It requires quite a lot. So if you're a community group and you take on a park and you then go and speak to your local clinical commissioning group and say, look, we're going to make this park available, and we can could we work with you so that you refer patients to the park? Would you know, if they get more likely to visit you less, would you make a payment to us, a performance-based payment? Now, the CCG might then turn around and say, well, in theory, that's fantastic, yes, because if we can encourage people to use green space, take more exercise, we'll see them less, we can treat more urgent cases much more. There is a saving to the taxpayer because we can do more with the money we've got. But actually converting that into an actual contract and a payment between a community group who are running the park and a CCG, that is a big challenge. That's never been done before. That's not to say it can't happen. But it's almost like we need a little bit of support to try to test and trial a few of these pilot projects, a bit like the government is supporting that in more the broader natural environment. You know, we have got the Environment Agency Investment Readiness Fund, and a lot of peat restoration and natural flood management projects and things are being supported. So maybe there does need to be a bit of a fund around parks and restoration of green space where potential groups coming forward to try to deliver these new business models do have a bit of funding support to try and explore some of this stuff.
Great, thanks, Dan. Really interesting. I guess related to that, one question that's come in kind of related to, I guess, wider government and environmental programs is what's the scope for green spaces to tap into new initiatives such as biodiversity net gain and elms? And I don't know if anybody feels equipped to have a go at that one.
Well, biodiversity net gain is an absolute no-brainer, and it'll certainly help protect some of the existing natural space, and it'll also help protect the buffers that surround critical sites, because very often you can have at the moment the obsession of more and more growth, and if it doesn't physically impinge on your core site, then it's difficult to argue against. But from a 10% net gain argument, we can start to hold those buffer developments to account so that actually that buffer protection to those core sites is enhanced or at least protected in some way, shape or form. So it's actually going to be quite critical, I think.
I think in addition, you'd also look at things like urban greening factors, building with nature, those sort of more potentially metric driven benchmarks, which can move towards becoming statutory on the back of net gains. So I think there's a whole suite of things coming forward where there's almost a little bit of the nudge from government and a nudge for developers to play ball a little bit, but they are sort of showing that there are very clear pathways to being greener, being more sustainable, and linking that into planning permissions, Section 106 agreements. It might be a way of trying to just almost facilitate a more positive conversation rather than how little do we have to give, going towards would it be better to do a bit more and therefore make it a bit easier.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. Really, yeah, it's really important stuff. This is a question that's coming for Cathi, but I think others of you might have perspectives on sort of related issues. Nick mentioned the importance of involvement of council departments other than parks. Have you been able to get buy-in and support from other departments in Bournemouth? So maybe health, children's services. If so, how was this achieved? And I think there's a wider question here about, you know, cross-sectoral working and linking up how environment sector within local authorities, but more broadly as well, works with the health sector and the other kinds of really important kind of sectors that basically all connect up in this kind of domain. But Cathy, to you first.
Yeah, I guess for us and with the projects, I guess we're delivering on the ground a bit more discreetly. So we work with our public health body, so Public Health Dorset. They've actually funded one of our initial social prescribing program to get that kick started. They funded that initially, and then we've been able to go on and get further funding from other grant funders as a result of that, with them still being a partner helping us with the evaluation there. And then through that, say the social prescribing program, we do try and work with CCGs and lots of local GP services, community mental health teams. It's probably on a small scale at the moment in reality because of what we're delivering, and something that we're aware of that we need to do more of, and especially with children and youth services, we don't actually have any programs which target those age groups specifically at the moment. So we'll look to, as and when we're delivering those sorts of projects, to work more closely with them.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to come in, Nick?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if the previous question, which was about net gain, you just have to ask yourself which would benefit the natural environment and green spaces more: a legal 10% net gain through planning, or a 10% improvement in health. And most areas of most cities need more than a 10% improvement in health. But in terms of what that would generate and how integral to that solution green is, it's an absolute no-brainer that's the way to go. And one of the partners in our program in Birmingham is also our corporate parenting children's trust. So in Birmingham, we're in the position where under the age of 25, we're looking after 3,000 young people in care. They have had no previous contact or connection with the natural environment. And that's what we're trying to look at, engaging them with, opening them up to potential new employment or different opportunities, and trying to hear their voice in terms of their concerns about the environment and everything else. So I think there's an untapped resource there that the environment sector definitely needs to break through those boundaries, and not be trying to solve things that are measured through environmental measures, because it's a societal issue, and we need to just accept that actually fixing the environment is not the issue. It's fixing the whole picture that's the issue, and how much could the environment benefit from these broader fixes if you were part of that solution.
Great, thanks, Nick. Really, really important. I'm going to move on to a question from Juliet. So this is for you, Ian, but Sian, maybe you've got a perspective that others may do as well. So Ian mentioned that the university could potentially play a part in funding or facilitating green space development. Could you elaborate on that a bit more? So what might the funding mechanisms be? How do collaborations work between universities and local government, and so on?
I think it would be similar to the way in which corporate social responsibility works. The University of Manchester, 45,000 students, 12,000 staff, give or take, and we have a massive impact on the city spatially, like geographically and economically. And I think one of the things that is often felt in university cities, and it might be the same in Exeter, that it's sometimes a little bit withdrawn from the people, the local people, and we sit literally in our ivory tower sometimes going, oh, this is all very, very horrible, we should do something. And given that universities they're charities, but they're also businesses as well, they potentially have resources that could work with local communities, work with local authorities to to take off some of that pressure for funding or for expertise. Here at Manchester, we have 2 departments in geography and my own in planning and environmental management, with a number of green infrastructure landscape planning experts who have expertise in how to do things and do it right, which, if that expertise is being lost from local authority, is there a way of helping, not necessarily things like secondments, but actually providing just that knowledge exchange with local government? We also have things like our social responsibility mandate, where students are encouraged to take part in local things. But I think also there's potential there for the university as an institution, and particularly as a civic institution, to develop more closely some potential funding mechanisms to support local greening initiatives or wider citywide climate change, or particularly Manchester surface water flooding initiatives. And I think here in Manchester, we've got Manchester Metropolitan, Salford. In Liverpool, you've got 3 universities. So there's the capacity there, and potentially it's not untapped, but they're institutions with a big financial clout, and maybe some of that could be pushed towards some of the big issues that Nick's talking about, that if we have it from the universities and the CCGs and such like, we might get some kind of fundamental shift in the way in which we can respond to change.
Thanks very much, Ian. I don't know if anybody else has got comments on those kind of partnerships. And Sean?
I guess just kind of Ian's point on the expertise, thinking about that, and kind of points that Dan was making about needing those real numbers, and a couple of people have mentioned vivid economics, and just thinking about, well, work that you and I have both done then with Vivid, kind of coming up with methods for calculating health benefits of green spaces. So those kind of providing expertise, I guess, is maybe not a direct funding mechanism, but something that is needed in order to think about these different funding mechanisms.
Great, thank you, Sean. We've just got a couple of minutes left. We've got a good long list of questions, so I'm afraid we won't be able to get to all of them today. But I guess I'll ask this question towards Dan, but other folks might have comments as well. There's a question here from Jocelyn, who says, can you summarise Mark Carney's work and how it will affect banks and the government in Britain, please? And I guess particularly in this kind of context.
Yeah, just because I work for a bank, it doesn't mean I necessarily study what Carney says. I'm actually slightly more interested in doing practical transactions. I think where this is going, though, is increasing obligations on governments and large corporates and probably local authorities to adopt climate neutral or climate positive policies, and if not do that, sort of effectively offset. And as a gradual move, as we're moving towards mandatory offsetting, it's all starting with mandatory biodiversity net gain in this country. One day, hopefully, we will end up with a carbon tax, but there might end up being sort of, at the moment, we're in a position where lots of the FTSE top 250, when you look on their websites, you can usually find your way through, and they will have a net zero policy, and they might well have a team. And it might not just be a CSR team, it might be a real team trying to achieve operational changes within that organisation to achieve net zero. And they may have a policy of looking to offset their emissions that they can't make changes to. And that is a source of funding, potentially, for projects, for NGOs and community groups. So I think any sort of direction of travel set by Mark Carney, working at sort of a global level, hopefully does filter down to governments, and you get governments like the UK government wanting to show the world we're leading in this area in tackling climate change and natural capital investment. And that gradually leads into a few innovative policies the government puts forward. And it's up to the rest of us to sort of latch onto some of this opportunity and pull it together and try and deliver some actual projects. And I see that as our role, actually, at the bank. And I'm sure, you know, all of us here are thinking, yes, there are all these elusive little revenue streams coming, and there are more coming. How can we find out what they are and harness them to actually to deliver some of this stuff? Because what we are seeing, I suppose, is the custodians of our green spaces, which were our local authorities. It appears that's not going to be the way it is in future. So who are the new custodians of the green space going to be? I find myself thinking on this call a little bit.
Well, I think that's a really nice place for us to end there. I think we're just hitting 2 o'clock, so I want to make sure we finish on time. Really interesting perspective on the future, perhaps a longer distance kind of future, and where we're going. So I'll just take this opportunity to say thank you very much indeed to Ian, Cathy, Dan, Nick, and to Sian, of course, and to everybody for joining us for this webinar. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think I've learned an awful lot. So really appreciate getting all of your perspectives, and thanks for great questions and comments. As Sian said, we'll be sending around the new report to everybody who's attended the webinar, and it will also be made available on our website, so you can check that out at sweep.ac.uk, and all the other projects in association with the whole sweep programme as well. So I'll leave it there. I hope you all have a good Friday afternoon. Stay safe, have a good weekend, and thanks very much indeed, everybody.
Thanks all.